Welcome to City Cinematheque, where the art and pleasure of the movies are the subject of serious discussion. I'm your host, Jerry Carlson, and I teach film studies at the City College of the City University of New York. This week, it's our pleasure to present one of the great classics of all film history, the 1920 production, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, one of the most important horror films in the development of that genre and a key example of German expressionism in the cinema. There's a lot to talk about this film because it's remained controversial for over 85 years. Some folks love it, some folks hate it, and there are reasons for both sides of that conversation. We'll be talking about the film's aesthetic, its historical context, and other subjects after today's screening. It's a pleasure to have back on City Cinematheque Professor Gilberto Perez from Sarah Lawrence College, an expert on the silent era who will be chatting about the film. Now, take this opportunity to enter the very strange world of the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Welcome back to City Cinematheque, and welcome back to a world that might have some right angles in it, because you've been in one that certainly didn't for well over an hour. There's a lot to talk about this film that is a classic of world cinema and remains to be a controversial film on a number of grounds. Happily, we have joining us once again on City Cinematheque Professor Gilberto Perez from Sarah Lawrence College. Gil has been our guest before. He's the author of numerous articles in journals such as Yale Review, London Review of Books, and Sight and Sound. And some of our viewers may know him for his masterful study of film aesthetics, the material ghost, films and their medium, still in print and available in paperback, as they say. Thanks for joining us today, Gil.
Glad to be here.
Let's start with perhaps the most obvious feature of this film, and that's the film's look, and the way in which the film uses settings in a way where certainly few have used exactly the same way. Talk about what it is and why it is that.
Yes, well, Caligari was originally a screenplay by two young writers, Karl Mayr and Hans Janowitz, and they envisioned their screenplay done in strange sets, expressionist sets. That was part of their original conception. Janowitz was from Prague, and his idea was to hire Alfred Kubin, who's a well-known expressionist artist, also from Prague. But then the director of the film, Robert Wiene, instead hired three other set designers, not Kubin, but also expressionists, Hermann Warm, Walter Riemann, and Walter Rohrig. And the sets of Caligari are extraordinary. They are certainly the most striking thing about the film. And reportedly, the producers were happy because it was cheap to make a film and painted sets like that. They didn't have to spend much money building actual three-dimensional things.
Right.
This was cheaper for them, and I think the sets are remarkable. They have been criticized. They're controversial, as you say. Some people find Caligari too theatrical, and this looked like theater sets to them, and of course they do look like theater sets. I myself don't think there's such a sharp division between film and theater, and I think Caligari stands up quite well as a film. Somehow it's one of these things that I read in my youth, that one of those phrases that stick in my mind. I remember Richard Roud writing, I think it was in Sight and Sound, saying the cinematic approach is naturalistic. Caligari is dead as a doornail. However, this is not the way it feels to me, not to my students. Caligari is a film of that era, of that early era. It's one of the films that plays best with young audience, in my experience, with young audiences today. It's certainly not dead as a doornail. It still works. Now, why does it work? It's fairly primitive in its film technique. it is set bound, obviously. And well, I can tell you, first of all, because the sets are remarkable, and the acting, for the most part, blends very well with these sets. Most notably Conrad Veidt as the somnambulist Cesare, and the way he moves in those sets. But also Werner Krauss as Caligari and the other actors. And so that works well as, say, graphic art. But then there's also the way that, well, the sets at first look flat. And of course, this is one contribution of film. They look flatter than they would do in the theater, because in the theater they would actually be 3 dimensions. Here you have a flat image, and the sets look flatter. But a lot of the staging in Caligari is done into the depths, so that it's that strange feeling that you look at this that looks flat. It looks like a woodcut. I think Herman Baum. These are woodcut come to life. Yes, but when you see this flat space suddenly extend into this depth, suddenly start moving, there's something spooky about that. It reminds me of that famous phrase of Weringer, that uncanny pathos that attaches to the animation of the inorganic. It does. So when you see this, there's something really uncanny about these flat things suddenly becoming alive. Well, and that's one of the ways I think they work, and it would not work quite that way as a theater piece.
Absolutely the case. I like that distinction you've made between how it would work in a theatrical space and how it works as filmic space. Just to add to that, there is the way in which within a lot of the classical cinema there is a use of a kind of Renaissance perspectivism that cameras can achieve, that we have a perfect sense of what the relationship is between the camera's position and a kind of horizon. Okay, or diminishing point. And one of the things that you're also pointing out towards is this upending of perspectival relations achieved within the film, which can take place on one way when Conrad Veidt when Cesare is going along, moving along a wall. There's the way in which he's being collapsed. You don't know where his body is exactly in relationship. I mean, it's against a wall, but there seems to be a permeability between these spaces, between the human form and the inanimate form in something of that kind. But equally so, because your example of these compositions in depth where they're running, but because of the way in which the sets are designed, all of the normal perspectival relations are confused to give us contradictory signals, contradictory clues about where we're going. So you say, well, there's a line, but wait a minute, if that line, then that shouldn't be in proportion over here in this way, but then that thing is too small, but that thing is too big. So where exactly are we in space, even when he was supposed to be running on a line, because the spatial relations are ambiguated in those ways?
Yes, and that of course contributes to the sense of dislocation, confusion, and which maybe is what I should have said at first. I didn't, because it seems obvious, the sense that these sets don't have, as you say, those lines of perspective. They have almost no horizontals and verticals, and horizontals and verticals, of course, tend to convey a sense of stability. And here you have all these tilted walls, this askew windows, this convoluted perspectives that throw you off in that way, and of course create that sense precisely of an unstable world, a world that seems at every point about to collapse. And in fact, if you actually built those buildings in real life, they would collapse. That's
a good point. But now I think you've actually gotten to the heart of part of the enduring appeal of this film. And while it may be even, because my students like it as well, I should say, but it's a conversion process that really takes place in the first 10 or 15 minutes of the film. There's a sort of kind of skepticism about the film as it first unrolls because it's so odd looking. But once they've entered this narrative world created by the film, there's a way in which, paradoxically enough, they find themselves at home in the unhomeliness of the film. The way in which the film creates that sense of of disorientation, which, there is a noble cinematic tradition that issues from this film of, to use the word you've already used, but just to repeat it, of the uncanny, of those films that don't place us in an illusionist world in which we're perfectly comfortable, which can be, on the one hand, films that make a strong claim to realism, like The Bicycle Thief, and we're there in that world, we're sympathetic with the character. Or, Star Wars doesn't make a claim to being reality exactly, it makes a claim to entering its special narrative world that it's created. But we're still supposed to be comfortable in that world. Whether it's neorealism or whether it's Hollywood illusionism, we're supposed to be somehow just following along. And here is the other cinematic tradition. It's the cinematic tradition of how cinema can, express for us or imitate for us that sense of not being at home in the world, being lost in the world in some way.
Right. Yes.
Good. Well, let's talk a little bit about these characters in the film, because we've talked about the sets and that. What do you make of the kinds of characters that were given in this film and the kind of story that we're being told?
Well, like the sets, the characters are expressionist. Expressionist characters are not individuals. Expressionism was not interested in individual psychology. The characters are allegorical figures, right. That like the doctor, the somnambulist, the woman, and then the two young men, the
right.
one who's the narrator and so forth. They're not individualized. They're not realistic characters. They are figures in an allegory, and in this typical of expressionism. Caligari is, of course, one of the best examples
right.
of expressionist art in any medium. Is one of those works that, if anybody wants to know what expressionism is, you just point to that. Yes, yeah. there it is. That's it.
Yeah.
And the story again has that quality of a fable.
Right.
Right.
Well, let's talk about.
And of course, it's a fable of fear, fable of discomfort in the world, as you
right.
were saying, anxiety.
Right.
And that's also typically expressionist.
You've brought up this, I'm going to say, useful but loaded word, and that is allegory. So how do you think this film works as an allegory? Why is the concept of allegory important for an understanding of this film?
Well, the most influential interpretation of this film sees it as an allegory of the First World War.
Okay.
However, before going there,
okay.
I think even if you don't read it as an allegory of the First World War, the film still moves as an allegory.
Right.
Now, you may then start wondering, what is it an allegory of? But the whole characterization, the whole movement of the story, it's obviously not referring to some piece of the real world.
Yeah.
It's referring, as allegory does, to another realm.
Right.
Now, Siegfried Kracauer, in his well-known books, From Caligari to Hitler, advanced the interpretation of it as an allegory of the First World War. This interpretation, he said, was based on statements made to him by Hans Janowitz, who was one of the two screenwriters. Both Janowitz and Meyer fought in the First World War, and they saw their story, according to Krakauer,
Okay.
as a parable of insane authority. And so Caligari, in this interpretation, Dr. Caligari represents the insane authority that sent the young men of Germany to fight and die in the war. And then the somnambulist, Cesare, is a figure of the young men of Germany. And he's, I think, the single most remarkable thing in the film.
Right.
The young Conrad Veidt is wonderful in the way he moves and so forth. And the figure is doubly allegorical in my reading of it. He represents both the killing and the dying. He lives in a coffin.
Yes.
He's a figure of death, and he's also a killer. So he represents the young men who were both sent to kill and to die in one figure, one allegorical figure. And when he opens his eyes in that famous close-up.
Absolutely.
And that, by the way, that particular scene when they go into the cabinet of Dr. Caligari is a scene that obviously the director felt was particularly important, and it is. And he has a greater variety in that scene of camera angles. There's long shots, there's close-ups of Dr. Caligari, of the young men in the audience, there's reverse angles, and then there's that great, surely one of the great close-ups in film history when this frontal tight close-up and Cesare opens his eyes slowly and stares straight at us.
Absolutely.
And it's like having death stare you in the face. So Caligari then is like the authority, the insane authority. Cesare is the young men of Germany. And that roughly is that interpretation of the film as an allegory of the First World War.
Let me both agree with you, but perhaps
this is Krakauer's interpretation, though the part about Cesare being both the dead and the killing, that's my contribution.
Well,
to that.
I want to come back to the kind of allegory this is, but I want to underline why Krakauer's argument, certainly to an initial historical audience about this film, would be compelling. And to do that, I just want to take 1 second to recover something that's a little bit lost to us today, some 90 years later, and that is the magnitude of killing in World War I. That essentially, in the major combatant countries, Germany, France, and England, 1 out of every 5 young men of the generation of being a young soldier was killed. If you're sitting in a pub and there are 5 friends there in 1914 who are 20 or 21, there will be, in 1918, 1 of them will be dead, another of them will probably be maimed in some way, and 2 or 3 will have survived. But that's every table in the pub. And for us, we've had a number of tragedies, in our own nation, etc. But that magnitude of trauma of a generation being wiped out. Now, I say that because that makes his argument, if this film is being addressed to an audience that's had an observation of that, then that, makes that particular allegorical reading all the more compelling.
Yes.
Having said that, I'm also on your side with the notion that this is not what I would call a closed allegory. What I call closed allegories are those ones in which you enter the narrative and then you are directed to one other reading, and that's the correct allegorical reading. This is much more, I think one of the enduring values of this film is that it's much more an open allegory. That while it admits that World War I reading of it, but as that reading fades, audiences seem to find other ways to allegorize this film.
Yes.
Perhaps that has to do with its dedication to creating this sense of not being at home in the world. And they weren't at home for a certain set of reasons after World War I, and we're not at home now for a very different set of reasons, but perhaps the film speaks to that.
Well, perhaps not so different.
Okay.
I mean, I was going to say that, yes, you're good. It was good that you reminded us of the the incredible number of deaths in the First World War. But let me also remind us of the madness of the First World War.
Oh, correct.
I mean,
correct.
It's really extraordinary. You have, at that point in history, Europe is certainly the dominant force in the world. I'm not saying this is good, but it's a fact.
It's a fact, yes.
It's a fact. It's the richest, the most powerful. There's all these colonies and so forth. And then Europe decides to kill each other.
Exactly.
And then after the First World War, it's pretty much over. Yeah. So it's like it's an exaggeration to say like it's a civilization committing suicide.
But it has a value to say it.
But it's at least some, large part of it committing suicide, or at least it's an extraordinary madness. And when you look at it from the perspective of 90 years, you wonder what would compel these people to do that to each other. And then, the allegory of madness, the madness of it. There's death and madness, right, in the allegory, and they both are powerful expressions of what did happen. Now, I think we also have death and madness today. So our difference, there are great differences, of course, but there are also some similarities, which may be why Caligari resonates today as well.
Right. Let's go. There's a different controversy connected with this film, and that has to do with this interpretation. It's been a long time debate that's led a number of people to, really into the archives to see who was writing what or who was controlling what, and that has to do with the ending of the film.
Yes.
And where we are at the end of the film. Could you just rehearse a little bit for us what?
Yes, the original screenplay by Meyer and Janowitz did not have the framing prologue and epilogue.
Right.
And this was an addition suggested by Fritz Lang. Fritz Lang was approached to direct the film, but he was otherwise engaged and he could not, he declined. But he suggested that a prologue and epilogue be added, framing the story and making the story a tale told by a narrator who at the end is discovered to be a bad man.
Right.
So, then Robert Wiene, who did direct the film, who took over when Lang could not take on the assignment, went along with that suggestion and did the film as we have it.
Right.
The writers, Meyer and Janowitz, strenuously objected to this because they felt this was a betrayal of their political message. That is, the message of insane authority. And then if it is the narrator, the young man telling a story who is insane, and Caligari then is all right. And so the figure that Meyer and Janowitz wanted to stigmatize as evil, as that insane authority, turns out to be vindicated at the end, and the man telling the story is the one who is a madman. And so the writers objected very much to this addition, and however, the director wanted it and the producer wanted it, and so this is the way the film was done. Now, Krakauer, in his reading of the film, completely agrees with the writer's objections,
right,
and says something like, initially, as conceived by the writers, Caligari was a revolutionary film, and then by the addition of the prologue and epilogue, it is turned into a conformist one. Yeah. Now, this, I think, is perhaps more debatable, though one can understand perfectly well why the writers were upset that this was added to their story. You were going to say?
No, I was about to say, the interesting point is the way in which Krakauer sets it up as this binary opposition. Yes. It's a revolutionary film or it's a conformist film. Whereas when particularly when I talk about the ending with this, with students, one of the features about the revelation of who's telling the tale is that, okay, now we know we're in an insane asylum, he's presumably unreliable. But then when, as it were, the baton of narration is passed over to the director, somebody trained in how normal movies work would say, well then okay, then we move outside of that special world that we've been in, and the sets are going to become regular. It's going to look like the regular world out there. But we never do that.
No, we don't, and people have speculated as to why we don't. One reason that has been suggested, this is Lotte Eisner, in her History of German Cinema, says that the producers were cheap, and they didn't want to spend more money building normal sets. Now, that may be so, but on the other hand, the producers must have felt that it was all right not to have the normal sets, because otherwise they're risking their whole investment.
Right, that's exactly right.
So they must have felt it was okay. Cheapness may have played a part, but it couldn't have been the whole thing. And then there's a very curious thing that, to my knowledge, no one has commented on. If you look at the end of The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, if you look first at the end of the story that the narrator tells, you see Caligari is put in a straitjacket and taken to this weird cell with this kind of biomorphic shapes around it and these odd windows and so forth, and tied there, okay?
We're running out of time, so wrap it up.
Then the narrator, in the actual end of the film, the narrator is taken to that same cell. And when he gets there, what you see very weirdly is that you see those biomorphic shapes still, but they have been rubbed out somewhat, but you still see them. Now, surely if it were a matter of cheapness, anybody can afford a coat of white paint if you want to get rid of those things. So what they did is leave this sort of ambiguity at visually you get that ambiguity in this double ending of Caligari. I'm going to have to end you with ambiguity.
This is a perfect place to end the debate, because the debate ends over the issue of ambiguity in Caligari. If you'd like more information about City Cinematheque or about CUNY TV, please visit our website. It's www.cuny.tv. You'll find click-ons for this program and for others, and ways to communicate with us by email. Again, that's www.cuny.tv. Gil, great 30 minutes and a great ending, because ambiguity is key to this film, so let's exit on that note. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Great. Thank you for joining us as well, and I hope you join us again as we stroll through the archives of film history. In any case, thanks for being with us today.